So, before we jump into things here, just some logistic stuff. So I have an announcement up there about the final exam and kind of like due dates and the final assignments that we have this week. So if we're kind of looking at this, I mentioned we have that fourth Canvas discussion, which is due by the end of the day today. We had that quiz five, which was due at the end of the day yesterday. We've got kind of some of these daily quizzes. Once again, they're always set to be due 2 days after we review them in class. So we'll kind of have yesterday's and today's due what before we start class tomorrow and before we start class on Thursday. We then have that fifth Canvas discussion, and then after class today, you'll see that sixth quiz pop up here and available, right? And that will be due at the end of the day, Thursday as well. So that fifth Canvas discussion, sixth quiz, due at the end of the day on Thursday. If you haven't already, hopefully you've finished up that kind of fourth Canvas discussion, due by the end of the day today. I also have kind of that honor lock test, the extra credits for 3 points. That's due before we start class on Thursday. So that way I make sure if you're having any issues, we could address those even during that review session and just making sure we're like a full 24 hours prior to you having to take the exam that we've identified if there's any issues. Okay. So that's kind of everything we have to kind of end out the semester. Um, We'll finish up module 12 today, and we'll have a little bit of spillover till into tomorrow, but really it's going to be we're going to take what we learned in module 12 and kind of combine it with stuff from modules 9, 10, and 11. So we'll kind of focus on that tomorrow, have some available time to do review, any questions you have over the practice problems for quiz 5 and 6, any questions you have over quiz 5, so the answers should be set so you can kind of release so you can see them now. And then I can't give you the answers. I worked through quiz six problems, but if you kind of have taken it and you're reviewing them, I could work through similar problems if you have questions over those the next 2 days as well. Okay. Um, Other than that, any questions for me before we get going here? Now, I also wanted to mention I've updated Canvas so that it's dropping your lowest module reading. After those kind of in-class quizzes, we're all done with those. I'll have it set so it's dropping your two lowest kind of in-class quizzes. So that grade you see in like your grade book should kind of reflect that. Okay. So let's pick up where we left off. So we said we're thinking about currency. There's going to be some overall demand for currency and overall supply. So we are only going to focus on the market for US currency and the exchange rate of the US dollar, right? So before we kind of go too deep into this, I just wanted to review, I think, something that might be helpful. That when we're talking about these exchange rates, so one of the things we said last class was the price of a good in terms of the foreign currency is the price of the good in terms of the US currency times the exchange rate, right? Essentially, if there was like 5 euros to every one US dollar, well, then whatever the price in the US is times the number of euros to get that same one US dollar, that's the total amount of the other currency or the price in the other currency. So when you think about this exchange rate, if we just kind of rearrange this, you could think about this as the exchange rate for the US dollar to kind of a euro, right? Or, sorry, think about it this way. It's just the exchange rate for the United States dollar. So if we rearrange this, we get the price of the foreign currency over the price of the US currency. If we normalize the price in the US to always be one, then essentially that exchange rate tells us how many units of the foreign currency get us one US dollar. So if we're thinking about like maybe it takes 5 euros to get one US dollar, our exchange rate is five. Now, if the exchange rate goes to 10 euros per US dollar, well, the exchange rate is increasing, but that means that for the US, the same dollar is going to get them more euros. We could kind of think about when the exchange rate increases, it's going to be increasing the value of the US dollar. So what are these things that cause increases in our equilibrium exchange rate? Well, anything that would increase demand. So when we're thinking about those things that increase demand, this is where we'll also have to make a differentiation. It's the same words, but it works differently. So when we were looking at the domestic economy, we were talking about investments into physical capital. So this was the idea if we want to make investments into these projects of physical capital, we had to take out loans. So there, the interest rate was a bad thing. If we're thinking about does someone want to make an investment into currency, they're not taking out a loan to do that. They're putting their money towards it and they're hoping for a high return. So there, higher interest rates actually make foreign countries want to hold US dollars or assets. So higher interest rates will actually increase the demand for the US dollar. Okay. And then vice versa, right? If I had I can think about it, if there's higher interest rates in the US, people want less of the other current, foreign currency. And then any increases in economic stability, that means that it's a less risky investment or a safer investment. So we would see people are more likely to want to invest in the US if we're become more stable. So there we would see an increase in the demand for the US dollar. Now the next two are going to be tightly related to each other. So if I think about prices, if prices are higher, that means that if I have the same amount of income in my pocket, if prices are higher, I can't buy as much. So higher prices actually lowers the value of the currency, which lowers demand, right? And then productivity, instead of increasing prices, when we have more productivity in a country, it means that given the same resources, we can produce things at a lower cost, which ultimately results in lower prices. So if more productive lowers prices, that means that now the same income or the same dollars that we have can buy more units. We'll see an increase in the demand for that currency as well. And then we said anytime any of these things, even if they don't change, but we expect them to, same impacts. And then we kind of had our catch-all category. Right? This is just a preference for foreign assets, etc. Any questions? So this is kind of we left off talking about this. From here it just becomes like any other market. We have the equilibrium being where supply is equal to demand. This is just going to be the supply and demand for US dollars. And then instead of the price, well, the price of a US dollar and other kind of currency is essentially the exchange rate. So increases in demand increase both the exchange rate and our equilibrium quantity. Okay. Quantity of US dollars in the international market. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Trying to keep an eye on the chat down here. It doesn't always pull open. Okay. So assume that we had, this, what's a kind of problem we could see that looks like this? So assume we have interest rates of the US or a country decrease. What happens to the equilibrium exchange rate for their currency? It's nothing too crazy here. So here I had instead, what if real interest rates in the US decrease? Hmm. Well, if that's the case, we could think about the quantity of US dollars. The price of a US dollar in terms of foreign currency is essentially the exchange rate. We've got some supply of the US dollar, and we've got a demand for the US dollar. So we started out with our kind of equilibrium exchange rate being right here. If the interest rate falls, that makes projects have lower returns if we're investing into projects that require the US dollar. So with lower returns, we would actually see demand for the US dollar decrease or shift to the left, right? What does a demand decrease do? It lowers exchange rates. Okay. Everybody with me on this before we keep moving here? So I left the next slide open. Let's think about how then this change, we're going to start to connect our different markets or our different graphs. So here we had the market for the US dollar, or I kind of call it sometimes, I don't, it's not the most technical way, but I think about it as like the money market, the international money market. So what impacts is that going to have when we're looking at the US economy overall, right? Or when we're looking at this aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. So aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Well, we said initially if we start out, long run and short run GDP are exactly the same. And we could even think about here's the initial price levels. If we see the exchange rate go down, okay, now I'll write underneath this here because I think this will help. So, what's the line of thinking here? If that original change, right, we had lower real interest rates, causes my exchange rate to decrease, how is that going to impact aggregate demand? Well, remember, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So when we have an international market, changes in the exchange rate are going to impact the exchange of goods between two countries, or it's going to impact net exports. How does it do that? Well, we said when the exchange rate goes down, that means the value of the US dollar, it's worth less of the foreign currency, so the valuation of the dollar will go down. What impact is that going to have on exports and imports? I think for me, the easiest one to think about is imports. If the US dollar has less value, we can't buy as many other products from other countries, so the imports are going to go down. Now, if the value of the US dollar goes down, inherently the value of every other currency would go up. So if we want to think about why, I'll try to connect this dot. So for now, we're just going to think about the value of the foreign currency would go up, which means they have more value. They're going to buy more from us. Exports are going to go up. That difference, which is net exports, will lower imports, higher exports. That would increase net exports. Okay. If that's the case, net exports increasing causes our aggregate demand to increase, which does what? So net exports increasing causes aggregate demand to increase, which increases our prices in the short run, but also increases our short run GDP. Okay. So I'll come back to this idea here in a second. But notice if GDP in the short run is now higher, what have we seen caused by that change in the exchange rate? We now have an inflationary gap. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? So a little bit of review here, and just to allude to some things that we'll talk about more tomorrow. So why does the value of these two currencies kind of work against each other? Um, or work in opposite directions. I shouldn't say work against each other. Well, remember we said what is the exchange rate for the US kind of dollar? It's the price of the foreign currency over the price of the kind of US dollar, the domestic currency. We said we normalize this to one. If it takes 5 euros to get 1 US dollar, if we think about the exchange rate for the euro, well, if we had 1 US dollar equates to 5 euros, essentially the exchange rate for the euro is the inverse of the exchange rate for the US. So if the exchange rate in the US goes down, like we had in our example, you could think about like the numerator is going down, the denominator here is going up, right? Or sorry, down. If this denominator is going down, the fraction is going up. So the exchange rate in Europe for the euro would be going up, whereas the exchange rate for the US dollar goes down. So they're always going to be working in kind of opposite directions. Okay. Now, if we wanted to go one step further here, so when I see this inflationary gap, and this is where we'll kind of tie everything together, and we'll focus more on like complete questions that look like this tomorrow. But if we have net exports going up and we said we had an inflationary gap, well, what are the two responses to that? Mhm. The first response would be we can use from the US government, we could use fiscal policy. So if we have an inflationary gap, we actually want to reduce GDP to that long run level. How can we do that? Well, here I should just, I'll use one and two. We could decrease government spending, or we said we could increase taxes, right? And then what's another tool that we have to resolve inflationary gaps? We said monetary policy, right? So with monetary policy, what we would want to do, oh, what do we want to do here? So I want interest rates to be lower, investment, and we're trying to kind of reduce it. So I actually want interest rates to go up. So here we would want, we could reduce the money supply. That would cause real interest rates to increase. That would cause kind of investments in the physical capital to then decrease, shifting down aggregate demand, decreasing GDP. So that's kind of how it would work. But really, what are two ways that we could then decrease that money supply? Well, we could sell securities, right? Take money out of the pockets of banks, right? So we're pulling money out of banks, we're decreasing the money supply. Or if we increase the required reserve ratio, we're forcing banks to set more of the money they have aside. There we go. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Sorry, I was trying to focus that there and I hit the wrong button. So, what if instead, so we just kind of connected shifts in currency to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. What's going to cause changes in the currency supply? So, this is where it gets a little tricky, but if we're thinking about when we're looking at this market, what we're really looking for is the amount of the US dollar that is the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar is the equilibrium quantity that we see out there in the foreign market, right? Being purchased and sold, right? So it's not like the US dollar in the domestic market. And so here we could think about anything that increases demand for a foreign country's currency or products is going to mean that, well, who would be increasing the demand for the foreign country's products? The US, right? That'd be one of, so if the US wants to buy more of this foreign country's products or currency, we'd have to convert our currency into theirs, or we were going to be increasing the supply of our domestic currency, right? If our demand for foreign products increases, we need to put more of our money, or we want to put more of our money towards those products, we're going to have to increase the supply of our dollar onto that foreign international market. Right? So anything that causes an increase in the demand for other countries would cause an increase in the supply for the domestic country, which we said we're always going to be thinking about the United States here. Okay. So if the US wants more Chinese products, we're going to see that the demand for their currency increases and the supply of our dollar, right? We want to convert more of our US dollars into yen, so the supply of the US dollar out there on the international market would increase. If it increases, what is this going to do? It's going to cause a decrease in the value of our currency. So how does that work? Well, just like any other markets we've looked at where we have an increasing supply curve, shifts to the right are increases in supply. So if there's a demand increase for another country's currency, the supply of the US dollar will increase. We want to kind of go out and purchase more of that. So we put more of our dollars out in the international market. That drives down the US dollar's exchange rate, right? And then we can kind of go through some other lines of reasoning, just like we did for changes in demand. Okay. Any other questions there before we keep moving? And I think I had a typo in the slides. I changed it. I'll re-upload them. I think this said increase, increase. Very clearly, I have the arrow showing this is decreasing, so it's not increasing the exchange rate, it's decreasing. Just probably copying and pasting some bullet points and forgot to update that. So how are we going to relate these supply shifts to the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model? So we'll kind of do that and then we'll kind of come back to simultaneous shifts. So I'll give you, if I can get my mouse over here, I'll give you an example of kind of one way we could start out thinking about shifts in supply. So let's say we've got prices in Mexico, right? And they are going to decrease. Okay. Well, if the prices in Mexico go down, what's going to happen to the demand for the peso, right? So if prices are lower in Mexico, is the US going to be more or less likely to buy products from them? More likely to buy kind of those Mexican products or their currency. So, what happens in the market for the US dollar, right? Well, we had our original supply of the US dollar, the demand for the US dollar. Here was kind of our equilibrium exchange rate. If we want to buy more Mexican products or currency, what do we have to do? We have to take more of our US dollars and put it out there on the international market. So we would see if we have an increase for the demand for another country's currency, the supply of our currency to the international markets would increase, which does what? Decrease the exchange rate. Okay. Any questions on that? Now, what impacts is that going to have on price levels in the US, right? And how is it going to impact those? So we've got our aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. We assume that we were kind of currently operating with no gap, right? Here was our kind of long and short run GDP. So if the exchange rate goes down, what happens? The value of the US dollar is falling. If the value of the US dollar is falling, once again, I think the easiest way to think about this is if our dollar has less value, we can't buy as much from other countries, imports is going to go down, right? And then if our value of our currency goes down, the value of other currencies goes up. They're going to be able to buy more of our products. So exports go up. Net exports is exports minus imports. This is going up, subtracting a smaller value. Net exports increase. So what happens? That exchange rate changing from initially the changes of prices in Mexico causes US prices to increase in the short run, causes GDP to increase in the short run, which now if GDP is too high, we've got an inflationary gap. Okay. So we can always connect changes in the international market and exchange rates to how are they going to influence our kind of economy overall, the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model through net exports. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that idea before we keep? All right. Let me make sure. Yeah, we'll go back to this example. So we're okay with that. Move to the kind of next topic, so to speak, which is we could have simultaneous shifts. So when we're looking at that loanable funds market, it had an increasing supply and demand curve. We talked about kind of simultaneous changes there, how to determine what those effects would be. Similar kind of idea here. So I think in the ADAS, aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, it, it depends on what made the most sense to you. It wasn't always advantageous to draw these shifts out if they had simultaneous shifts separately. However, for most people, I think it is. And I think that drawing them out separately becomes more useful to more people when we have these models where we have increasing supply and demand curves as opposed to like a vertical supply curve. So we're going to kind of draw these out separately. Here, if we have different combinations of supply and demand for the US dollar increases or decreases, that could change the equilibrium quantity of the currency and exchange rate in different ways. So it could increase it, decrease it, or if we have simultaneous shifts and they push either one of these things in opposite directions, the answer would be it's indeterminate, right? Or we cannot determine. So what if we had an example like this? So let's say the US experiences high inflation and another country becomes more economically stable. Okay. So we'll think through these kind of impacts. So the first, I'll think about this quantity of the US dollar in international markets. I've got my exchange rate. I'm going to kind of just not use as many subscripts here just to kind of make this easier, or at least my writing a little bit quicker. So let's kind of draw these out separately, these two shifts, right? So the first thing we're told is what? The US has inflation. Let me double check. Yep, that's what I said. Okay. So if the US experiences inflation, what does that mean? It means that US prices are going up. So if the US prices are increasing, well, with the same amount of money, if the products cost more money, I can buy fewer products. So from other countries, that's going to cause the demand for US products and consequently the demand for the US dollar to decrease. Right? What are the impacts of that? Well, it's going to lower our exchange rate, but it's also going to lower the equilibrium quantity of US dollars out there on the market. So we see a decrease in the exchange rate, a decrease in the quantity of US dollars. Right? Now, what if at the same time we said another country's economy becomes more stable? Well, if we use an example like if the European economy becomes more stable, does that make the US more or less likely to want to invest in it or to purchase the European Union's currency? Well, we'd want to invest or increase our demand, right, for the European products. Well, if we want to buy more euros, essentially, what does has to occur? Well, we have to supply more US dollars to those international markets. If supply increases, it would look something like this. So what happened to equilibrium exchange rates? They go down. The equilibrium amount of US dollars out there in the market, excuse me, goes up. So I would always kind of usually stack these, right? So I just forgot to draw my arrow here, but if demand decreases, well, at the same time, we saw a supply increase, and the resulting impacts of that was that it decreased our exchange rate, increased the quantity of the US dollar. So I don't have a green marker. I left it open and it died on me. So I do have a green pen, so bear with me here. But what's the total effect if these happen at the same time? Well, the exchange rate is definitely going to decrease, but the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar, these simultaneous shifts push them in opposite directions. So the answer would be it's indeterminate, right? We don't know unless you tell me one of these shifts or one of these changes has a larger impact on this uh, international kind of this market for the quantity of US money than another. So here, if I told you, for instance, that the change in US prices, the effect that it had was greater than kind of that increase in stability in the foreign country, then I know what effect is going to kind of dominate the impact of those US prices. So the total effect there, if that is larger, I would know that the quantity of the US dollar would decrease, right? So, but I would have to know the relative size in order to determine that. Okay. In fact, so before I add this in, um, this is what I would have drawn out. I would stop here if I were you, but I just want to kind of show you why drawing it out on the same graph might be misleading. Because if I only drew this as a really small supply increase, it looks like my new equilibrium quantity is lower, right? But if I drew a really large supply increase, it now looks like my quantity is higher. So the relative size of those shifts when we do have simultaneous shifts matters. And that's where I think drawing them out on separate graphs, kind of looking at the impacts of both changes, makes it a little bit easier to see what that total effect is going to be. Okay. Any questions on that before we? Okay. All right. So, what impacts is that then going to have on net exports, right? So, if we kind of have the same example, right? We just walked through higher inflation, that means prices in the US are higher, decreases the value of the currency, decreases the demand for the US dollar. Other country becomes more stable, their currency is like worth more, which means our currency is worth hold on, what do I want here? If the other country becomes more stable, sorry, that's actually going to cause our supply to, we just worked through this, right? Increase, right? We would see an increase in the supply of US dollars, right? Because that, oh, there we go. That other currency now um, has more value. We're more likely to want to hold it. Um, so in order to buy more of it, we have to supply more. Okay. So that's what we just kind of the models that we just worked through. Um, so if that's the case, what's the impact on net export? So even when we have these simultaneous changes, once we know what the exchange rate is, we can still go through this line of thinking with net exports. So for us, we said it doesn't matter what the size of those shifts was. The exchange rate was definitely going down, right? So we could then chase this down a little bit further. And this is where I think I'll go farther than the question on the slide had, because I could ask you additional questions on the quiz or the exam. So let's say I think about the overall real GDP in an economy. I've got my kind of initial equilibrium where short run and long run GDP are exactly the same. Okay. If we had exchange rates go down, which was kind of the impact of those simultaneous shifts, what does that do to the value of the US dollar? It would decrease it. If the US dollar has less value, we're going to buy less from other countries. Right? If the value of the US dollar goes down, the value of the foreign currency goes up. We said those kind of have to work in opposite directions, which means if their currency has more value, they're going to buy more of our products. So what's happened to net exports? Well, there, if net exports are exports minus imports, right? This went down, this went up, net exports are going to increase, right? So if we then know that net exports are going to increase, that was one of the components of aggregate demand. So what's going to happen in the short run, prices will be higher, and so will short run GDP. Now, in the long run, we said as this economy adjusts, that short run aggregate supply would kind of shift up here. Or what do we have? We've got an inflationary gap. So even if we're impatient and we don't allow kind of that short run aggregate supply to respond, we could see either fiscal or monetary policy that pushes us to this kind of long run equilibrium. But if we just wait here, that change in the exchange rate, shifting aggregate demand, our new long run outcome will be at the same long run GDP. So that could be like a, I hate the term of trick questions, but here changes just in aggregate demand that come from changes in the exchange rate don't impact long run real GDP, but they would impact long run prices. Okay. So kind of tying these international money markets to our um, aggregate supply, aggregate demand model here. How does it do that? The way the exchange rates would affect aggregate demand is through net exports. Okay, that's the channel. Okay, so where are we at in time? All right, keep an eye on this. So I don't know, here's kind of like a summary. We could work through a bunch of different examples of simultaneous shifts. So the one that we just did was a what? Supply increase, demand decrease. We could do any other combination. So probably have, some more examples. I'm sure if people ask tomorrow, or I might kind of bring in some examples to work through where we just get different combinations of this, but we would work them out the same way that we just did. Okay. So the next thing that we're going to kind of take a look at is I want to tie in the monetary, the market and the decisions of the Fed to influence interest rates, and then the resulting impacts that has on the exchange rate and the economy. Right? So this is where if I asked you a type of question like this, I will direct you towards what channel you're thinking about. So I will, at the end of this, give you kind of a more complex example, but as far as I would push you is about what we're just to work through. About what, wow, is about the farthest I would push you is about as far as what we're just going to do. Okay. So if the Fed increases the interest rate, what is going to happen to the exchange rate of the US dollar? How is that going to, or what's going to happen to the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar? How will that impact net exports? And then consequently, how is that going to impact prices, real GDP? So just to kind of go through the thought and then we'll draw it out here. If interest rates are higher, right, then that means more countries are going to want to invest or put their money into US financial products because those payoffs, those returns are higher. So we would see an increase in the demand for US products inherently, and then consequently the US dollar, right? As that dollar demand for that dollar increases, that drives up our exchange rates, but also increases the quantity of the US dollar we see on the international market. As the way to think about this is we've seen an increase in the exchange rate. That means the dollar is more valuable or it's appreciated. If it's appreciated, we're going to be able to purchase more foreign products than before, so imports would increase. Other countries' currencies depreciate when the US dollar appreciates. That means they're able to buy fewer of the US products or exports decrease, which means net exports go down. Okay. So we could kind of draw this out, and I'll point some other things out along the way. So, okay. So I'll add some things in here I think that make it a slightly more complete example. So let's say instead of just telling you what the Fed is doing to interest rates, let's think about the domestic market or the kind of currency for the market for US currency just within the United States. So we said there we would have some type of demand for money, and then the Fed essentially sets that supply of money. So if we started out, here was our equilibrium interest rate. If interest rates increase, so maybe there's a question on the exam that could ask you for this. If interest rates increase, how would we get that? Well, we would actually need to see a decrease in money supply to get those higher interest rates. How can we decrease the money supply? So we want to take money away from the banks or out of the economy. So if we sell bonds or securities, we're taking money away from the banks. They have less available money to kind of give out loans, etc. Right? So if we wanted to think about this, we said the change in the money supply is the change of deposits into these banks times 1 over that required reserve ratio. So by selling securities, we're taking money away that these banks can loan out. We can think about this as though we're decreasing the deposits and decreasing our money supply. If instead we increase that required reserve ratio, we're forcing banks with the same amount of money, they have to set more of it aside. So if they have to set more of it aside, right, what's happening, excuse me, what's happening is that they have less money to kind of loan out, or we see a decrease in that money supply. So both of these tools by the Fed would work. So this is kind of review of Module 11. But if they decrease the money supply and increase interest rates, how is that then going to impact our international markets and our exchange rate for the US dollar, right? So if we have supply, demand for the US dollar, here's our initial exchange rate. And I think even here I asked you about what the equilibrium amount of the US dollar in the international market is. Okay. So we'll chase down this idea. So if we have an increase in interest rates, that means that when other countries invest into US financial assets or in US currency, their returns are going to increase, which means they're more likely to want or demand that US dollar. So we see an increase in the demand for the US dollar because of this increase in the real interest rate caused by the Fed. What is that going to do? That's going to cause our exchange rate to go up and the equilibrium quantity of US dollars to increase. That was kind of some of the questions that we had in that slide. And you might be thinking about something that I'm going to come back to, but for right now, let's just think about what does the effect of the exchange rate have? Well, okay, in our economy, right? Well, we said changes in the exchange rate. How is that going to impact things in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model? Right. So here was our kind of initial short run and long run GDP. We said exchange rates. This is the exchange between two countries. You can think about this as it's going to impact, if this is the exchange of products and currency between two countries, exchange rate changes will influence net exports. So if the exchange rate here is higher, right, for the US, the US dollar has increased value. We can buy more products, which increases imports. However, other countries' currency is now devalued, so they can't buy as many US products as before, so exports goes down. Both of these would cause net exports to decrease. So we could then think about, I forgot to put in here, here's my initial prices. If net exports go down, we would have kind of this decrease in our aggregate demand, which causes what? Short run GDP to decrease, short run prices to also decrease. If GDP is too low, we've now seen a recessionary gap caused by the initial change by the Fed. Okay? So we can kind of take that initial change by the Fed and follow it all the way down to what's the impact that that has on real GDP, and is it causing recessionary or an inflationary gap. Okay. Any questions on that? So two things I want to add in, but likely wouldn't do something this complicated on the quiz or exam, but it I think will help you think about even the easier questions. So in case, the initial change by the Fed, we were starting out with no gap and it caused a recessionary gap. Well, if the Fed lowered GDP, what is something that they, or what is one reason why they would want to lower real GDP? If instead of starting with no gap, we started out with an inflationary gap. So the response by the Fed, right? If we had an inflationary gap, it would help reduce that or lower GDP through international markets. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky because if real interest rates go up, what did we say? So if real interest rates increase, what happens to domestic investments into physical capital? Well, there to invest in the physical capital, they had to take out loans. Higher interest rates make loans more costly. So kind of our I decreased. If investments are decreasing, what does that do to aggregate demand? Well, that would actually cause, hold on. Did I get this right here? So if our exchange rate goes up, we're going to import more. No, that's right. So if we have these things happening simultaneously, that higher real interest rate reduces investment. And so what is the change going to be there? An even larger change or a larger decrease in aggregate demand. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep going? So I wouldn't give you one in which I give you necessarily ask you to work out this entire thing, but we actually kind of already looked at this in module 11. So this is where I could tell you the way I would set the problem up is more so what impacts does that interest rate have on kind of the overall economy? And then as a secondary effect, we said when we change interest rates as the Fed, the secondary effect was how it impacts net exports. Now, we kind of glossed over this at the end of module 11. This is how it's actually impacting net exports. That's where that secondary effect is coming from. So there's the initial kind of shift in aggregate demand that's caused by decreases in investment because of the Fed's actions. And then as a result, we kind of said there will be an additional impact or a secondary effect because of its impact on net exports. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. Oh, let me think what we want to do here with the remainder of class. So I went a little bit quicker with you guys than I did my earlier section, so I want to think if there's something else we could work through that would be helpful. We'll start with a daily quiz. If we have extra time, I'll throw some stuff in there at the end. So we're actually going to probably not have time to go through these last two slides. I'll likely start out with them tomorrow's class. It's nothing too crazy. It's a different way of thinking about the things that we've talked about. And then this is kind of interesting. If we have time, we can think about um, purchase power parity and I don't know. This is a kind of an interesting way to think about things that we see occur in the real world and that might seem kind of counterintuitive. So we'll kind of save this for tomorrow. What I want to look at here today is, and let me make sure I'm in the right section. Yeah, if we come all the way down here, I'm going to publish the quiz for today. So we're going to take a look at this. I'm going to build this, and I'm actually going to change the time so that we have ample time to kind of get this answered. Might take us the next 20 minutes. So, well, where's my save button? I can just return and come back into it. Um, so we've got three questions in this quiz, and that's because I know that any one of them I could kind of give you a problem like this on the quiz or the exam. So let's go here. We don't want to see the answers ahead of time. We want to work through this, make sure we can do this on kind of starting from a blank thing. So question one is assume we have interest rates increasing simultaneously. The economic conditions in Mexico increase. I'm actually going to give you a different example here, just to we kind of did one like this earlier. But then we want to know what happens to the equilibrium quantity of the US dollar uh, if the change caused by these interest rate was greater than, or sorry, what would it have to be if we saw the quantity of US dollars increase? What would have to be true about the relative size of these changes? And then if we instead we did see the interest rate go up, what's going to happen to um, or sorry, if we have a certain relationship between these two changes, what's happening to our equilibrium exchange rate? So we'll kind of work through this, right? We're thinking about a simultaneous change. So what I'm going to do here is draw them out separately, right? So we're thinking about the quantity of the US dollar, exchange rate. Once again, I'll probably shorthand this, draw it out a little bit quicker just to kind of save us some time. So we've got our initial exchange rate, initial quantity of the US dollar. We've got two things changing, so I'm going to draw these kind of two things out separately. So bear with me as I'm kind of getting this all written down for us here. Okay. So the first thing we had was an increase in the US's interest rates. Yes. So if we see an increase in US interest rates, then for foreign countries investing into these US financial products or buying the US dollar provides a higher return, which means that there's going to be an increase in the demand for these US products or the US dollar. So we get this demand increase, which does what? Increases exchange rates, but also increases the quantity, equilibrium quantity of US dollars that we see there out in the market. So we've got an exchange rate increase and an increase in the quantity of US dollars. Okay. Now, instead of the economic conditions in Mexico becoming more like increasing or it becoming more stable, let's say we expect, uh, this is a weird one, but let's say that productivity, this one's not too weird, it's just kind of more steps. So if productivity increases in Mexico, right, what does that do to prices in Mexico? Well, if things are more efficient, that means they can produce things at a lower cost, so the price is going to be lower. If the price is lower, do the products in Mexico become more or less attractive than before? More attractive. So the US wants to buy more products or buy more pesos. They have to take more of their US dollars in order to do that. So there we would see a supply increase. What did that supply increase do? So here we've got a supply of the US dollar increase. That's going to cause our exchange rates to go down. But the quantity of the US dollar, sorry, this should have been one and two, of the US dollar to increase. So we've got decreases in exchange rate from the other simultaneous effect and an increase in the quantity of the US dollar. So here, if we're asked about when these things happen, I think the question said originally, what's true about the relationship? In order for us to see the quantity of the US dollar go up, which of these effects has to be larger? Well, if they're both driving the quantity of the US dollar up in these international markets, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter which one of these is larger. They're both pushing that equilibrium quantity of the US dollar in the same direction. So for that first one, it doesn't matter which of those effects is larger. Now, for the second question, right? Well, if we have, or the second part, I should say, of that question, what's our total effect if these things happen at the same time? Well, we just said we know that the quantity of the US dollar in these international markets has to be higher, but they're both pushing the exchange rate in opposite directions. So the answer would be it's indeterminate. We don't know. Okay. But if we are then told, okay, that thing that was increasing demand, so this was like our US real interest rate that was changing and causing that, if that effect is greater than the supply increase that was coming from, I think in the original question it was more stability in Mexico. Here I changed it to kind of the productivity increase, right? Well, if this effect is larger, then its impact on exchange rates will be the one that dominates. So there, if we're told that the effect of that US real interest rate changing is larger, we know its impacts on exchange rates would dominate and we would see an exchange rate increase. Okay. So it does not matter. An increase would be kind of the answers to that first question. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So we're going to skip around a little bit. So instead of question two, we're going to start with question three, just in case we kind of get a little bit too close to the end of class here. So for question three, and I'll give you the answers to two if we don't have enough time. So on question three, right? Assume that the real GDP in the US, we start out in our long run equilibrium. So this is the idea that short and long run GDP are the same. The Fed then buys US securities. What impact will that have on the equilibrium exchange rate? And then on the quiz or exam, I'd probably be a little bit more explicit. I knew we were going to work through this one in class, so I probably wrote it a little bit quicker. But essentially, I asked what happens to the exchange rate, and then what would the effect of that exchange rate be in terms of creating an inflation or deflationary gap? Okay. We know that the monetary policy of the Fed will not only change exchange rates and net exports, but it also would impact like domestic investment and physical capital. Here, we're just focusing on its impacts on that international market. So to work through a problem like this, we're now thinking about, all right, if I have, oh, let me make sure I'm kind of matching this up correctly with the actual problem. I sometimes read these too quick. Okay. So we've got the Fed is buying securities, right? So if the Fed buys securities, what's happening in the money market? This hasn't really technically what we should call it, but I think it's the easy way to think about it for me. So we've got the demand for money. We said the supply of money is this vertical line. We have our initial interest rates. Okay. If the Fed buys securities or bonds, it puts money into the banks that should increase the money supply. Increasing the money supply does what to our interest rates? Decreases them, right? We can then think about what impacts would this have on international markets for the US dollar. So here we start out, we've got our demand for the US dollar, we've got our supply for the US dollar, we've got equilibrium exchange rates, right? I think this is as far as we could worry about the quantity, but here we just care about exchange rates. So if interest rates go down, then for other countries thinking about investing into the US dollar or projects that require the US dollar, that essentially lowers the returns, which means that our demand for the US dollar is going to decrease. Right? So if we get this decrease in demand for the US dollar, what's that going to do? It's going to decrease exchange rates. Right? We could then take this one step further. Right? Didn't save myself a ton of room here, but so here, if we then think about, okay, what would the impacts be on the US economy? Right? So we've got our aggregate demand, we've got long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Here's kind of where our long and short run GDP initially start out. Um, so just as a point to make here, the final exam is not cumulative. I will not be asking you directly the questions that we kind of looked at for any module prior to module 9. However, we were talking about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model back in module 7. We're still using it, right? So in fact, it is not cumulative, but we're just reusing concepts. So they're already kind of baked in, right? So if you want to, if you're reviewing old modules, even though it's not on the exam, I could see some value in reviewing module 7 a little bit, right? If I'm getting that right off the top of my head, I think that was our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Um, so we just wanted to mention that at this point. So we then have, right, what are the impacts of this exchange rate? So if the exchange rate goes down, we said the value of the US dollar is going down. If it has less value, our imports are going down, right? If the dollar has less value, foreign currency or the foreign dollars, you can think about, actually increases in value, which means exports, the amount of goods they can buy from us, would go up. So if exports increase, imports decrease, that gap in between them, or our net exports, would be increasing. That's one of the components of aggregate demand. So if aggregate demand increases, what happens? Our new GDP in the short run is higher. If GDP is too high, we've got an inflationary gap. Okay. So there we would see exchange rates from initial change, which was the Fed buying US securities and bonds, that impacted interest rates, which then impacted exchange rates, which then impacted net exports, which then caused inflation or deflationary gaps. Right? So we're, tying a lot of things in together here. Okay. And, drawing these out is helpful. I could see, and I might, go through some other things like this tomorrow during our review and just, adding in more examples here. If I'm thinking about my handwritten notes for the exam, maybe it's useful to kind of, instead of being able to draw out every single one of these, having a kind of shorthand summary. So we could go all the way back to thinking about like monetary policy. So there we said if the Fed kind of buys securities or they decrease that required reserve ratio, that did what? Increased our money supply. Increases in the money supply cause interest rates to decrease, right? So this is kind of our monetary policy. And then we could do the exact opposite, right? If they sell securities or increase the required reserve ratio, that would decrease money supply. If we decrease the money supply, we would be increasing interest rates, and we could draw all of these changes out. Now, the next thing I would think about is, okay, once we have this change in interest rates, kind of how are interest rates and exchange rates related? Well, we said if interest rates are higher, that would increase demand for the US dollar. Right? And then down here, if demand for for the US dollar increase, we said, what is that going to do to my exchange rates? It would increase them. And then we have the exact opposite effect. If interest rates go down, the demand for the US dollar goes down. If the demand for the US dollar goes down, exchange rates also go down. And then we could think about, okay, how does exchange rate relate to net exports? And I might not always give you like one example that includes all these. We could see kind of like it broken down, different questions that hone in on these specific relationships. So here we're going to say, okay, if exchange rates go up, the value of the US dollar, we have more value. So we're going to see imports go up and net exports actually decreases, right? If we then have the opposite, exchange rates go down, the dollar has less value, we're going to import less, net exports there would go up. And then finally, we could think about what impact is this change in net exports going to have? Well, if net exports go down, we said aggregate demand decreases. If aggregate demand decreases, so does kind of our GDP in the short run, which would then cause GDP to be too low. We've got a recessionary gap. And then the opposite is true. If net exports go up, aggregate demand goes up, short run GDP goes up, and there we would end up with an inflationary gap. So if it helps you to have this written down and in front of you, this could be part of your handwritten notes going into that final. Okay. Excuse me. Any questions on that before we keep chugging along here? Okay, so here is something we didn't talk about today. We'll go through more examples of this during tomorrow's class, but since we have time, I think it'll be helpful to go through it now before class ends. Okay. So in question two, and just to be clear there, sorry. So we had, oh, now I'm already forgetting. What did we say up here? This was doesn't matter, an increase, I believe we worked through. We said here the exchange rate was going to go, now we got to look back in our example that we did. The exchange rate is going down and we're creating an inflationary gap, right? And then we'll kind of work through this one. Okay. So question two says, if I have a productivity increase in the US, okay? So I'm just going to think about this through the money market or the international market for right now, but I have something I might show you at the end too if we have time. So if I start out, here's my equilibrium exchange rate, right? If I see productivity increase in the US, that means that prices, right? If we are more effective at producing things, prices will go down. That means if prices are lower in the US, more people are going to want the US dollar. So here, increases in demand for the US dollar would do what? Increase that equilibrium exchange rate. Okay. So the exchange rate will increase, right? Which will cause what? An inflationary recessionary gap, or we can't determine. Well, if we think about recession or inflationary gaps, we need to take a look at our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we were told the additional information was, and usually you're given this, just so we kind of start off making sure we're all thinking about it on the same page. GDP in the long run is exactly the same as GDP in my short run. We start out with no gap. If we increase exchange rates, what is that going to do? It's going to increase the value of the dollar, which then means we can increase imports. Remember, if net exports is exports minus imports, so this is where it'll always work in the same direction. If it's easier just to think about what happens to imports and how that impacts net exports, that's fine, right? So if we increase imports, what are we doing? We're decreasing net exports. Once again, the other effect would be that if the value of the dollar goes up, the value of the foreign currency goes down, which means they export less, which has the same impacts on net exports. So this is where if it's just easier to think about how does the value of the dollar impact imports, then that's fine. Okay. So we've got what was the exchange rate goes up, net exports is going to go down. So what does our new aggregate demand curve look like? It's going to decrease. So that means our short run GDP is now lower or lower than the long run outcome, which means we have a recessionary gap. Okay. Now, if we have a recessionary gap, this is where if things change in international markets, what can the US government do? Well, if we've got a recessionary gap, what do we want to do? We want to increase, GDP in the short run. How can we do that? We need to increase our aggregate demand curve. So what tools does the government have to increase aggregate demand? Well, one, we could increase government spending, which I believe is the question that we're looking at here. It's what happens should they increase or decrease spending? Well, they should increase it, right? Now, it could be a different question, which isn't necessarily maybe ask you like multiple options. You could increase government spending, or you could lower taxes. Those would both increase aggregate demand, helping to close that recessionary gap. So any changes in the international kind of the market for the US dollar, whatever impacts it has on our economy, we can combat that, right, through the use of fiscal policy, right? Or we talked about or looked at earlier kind of that relationship between monetary policy and inflationary deflation. So we could also use monetary policy here, which we'll dive into that a little bit more next class. But if we had monetary policy, this is where I think it's easier to kind of kind of work backwards. Um, so question two says, so the exchange rate should increase. Oh, did I flip this around when I was working through this? So imports and net exports decreases. Let me make sure. Do I have this accidentally set incorrect? He's fill in the blanks. So an increase. So we increase imports, we decrease. Should cause a recessionary gap, and as a result, the government should increase. Yeah, sorry. So those last, sorry. So the way that we worked through this is correct. If you're submitting this, it's going to look like this is wrong. I'll go back through and kind of update this so that it kind of gives credit for recessionary gap and increase, right? I think I must have just went through this quick once again. I sometimes am bad with these daily quizzes. I forget that if I accidentally scroll it, or if I don't kind of select it automatics to like the first one I put in there. So I'll make sure I get this kind of reset after class. Thank you for asking about that and pointing it out. Okay. So I'll get that updated as soon as I'm done here. Okay. So the answer should be recessionary and increase, right? I'll kind of change that. So make sure you're getting that submitted. I had one more minute before we got derailed because of my uh, lapse in being very specific or paying attention to those details there. If I wanted monetary policy, this is where we said you have to chase it backwards. So if we wanted to increase aggregate demand, how does the Fed impact the aggregate demand curve through interest rates that impact investment? We would want to increase investments, which means we need to lower real interest rates, which meant we need to increase the money supply. How do we do that? We go all the way back to we could then um, our earlier amount, we could buy securities or we could lower that required reserve ratio. So we'll start to chase down kind of these subsequent effects of recession or inflationary gaps, how the government could respond using either fiscal or monetary policy. We'll kind of look at these more complex models where we're kind of tying in multiple markets or multiple graphs to each other. And then we'll kind of have it open for review. Any questions you have, I'll kind of work through those tomorrow and Thursday. We might have different questions in the different sections, so I'll post both sections videos to each, to the playlist that we have on YouTube. So even if you attend the live class, and we might work through similar ones, if people stop asking questions, I've got a set that I know might be useful to work through since I have the exam written. Um, but it might be valuable to kind of skim through that other section's recording that I post to our YouTube playlist just to see if we work through any different problems. That just gives you more things to review. Okay. All right. So I'm going to end the recording there.